There are two main types of research designs, experimental and observational. Our previous lecture covered experimental research designs, and in this lecture we're going to shift our focus and talk about observational research. Experimental research designs give us a lot of leverage to specify the causal relationship between variables that we're interested in. However, as we discussed in the previous lecture, there are limitations and drawbacks to the experimental strategy. So if we decide not to evaluate our causal theory in an experimental setting, our other option is to do an observational study, where we collect real-world data on the variables that we're interested in without any experimental manipulation. In observational research designs, researchers don't have any control over the values of the independent variable that different units or subjects receive. So assignment of the independent variable isn't random, it happens naturally, so it's not controlled by the researcher. In an observational study, the conditions that we need to meet in order to do causal inference are exactly the same as they are in the experimental setting. We need to be able to specify a credible causal mechanism between our variables of interest. We need to rule out the possibility of reverse causality. We need to make sure that there is correlation between x and y, and we need to consider whether we have controlled for all the confounding variables that might make the association between our variables spurious. So the first of these hurdles is just whether we have a theoretical reason to believe that there is this causal connection between x and y. And the third hurdle is a question just about our data, about whether we observe a covariation between x and y. So these hurdles are pretty similar in terms of how we go about achieving them, regardless of whether we're doing an experiment or an observational study. However, we can argue that finding a credible theoretical causal mechanism connecting x and y is more important when we're doing an observational study than in an experimental study, because it's harder to pin down the causal relationship between x and y when we're doing an observational study. So being able to tell a credible theoretical story about why x causes y might be more important if the research strategy that we're following is an observational one. The second and fourth causal hurdles pose a bit more of a problem, so let's go through each of these in turn. The second hurdle says that when we have a causal theory that x causes y, we want to make sure that we don't have that story backwards. So we need to rule out the possibility that y causes x. An example of this would be if we had a causal theory that economic development causes democracy, that as countries become more economically developed, more rich, that those countries are more likely to democratize. However, we might also want to take into account the possibility that democratizing causes a country to have greater economic growth. So that would be a reverse causal relationship in this particular situation. So this is something that is difficult to disentangle in observational research. There are a couple of strategies that we have for trying to make sure that reverse causation isn't the reason that we see the relationship between the variables that we're interested in. One of them is to tell a really strong theoretical story about why the causal arrow points in the direction that we theorize it does. Another option is to collect data on changes in the independent variable that precede changes in the dependent variable, to make the case that because of the timing of the way that these variables change, that it makes more sense for x to be causing y than for y to be causing x. But in observational research, this is a harder hurdle to cross. The biggest obstacle to doing causal inference based on observational data, however, is the problem of omitted variables. So, you'll recall that in the experimental setting, random assignment is what allows us to find a causal relationship between x and y without worrying about confounding variables, because the control group and the treatment group are randomized, and so systematic differences between those groups have been eliminated by the random assignment procedure. In observational research, we don't have the ability to randomly assign our subjects into treatment and control groups, into groups with different values of the independent variable, and so we don't have that leverage on the independent variable. What this means is that in observational research, we have to be very careful about accounting for all of the other variables z that could be impacting this observed relationship between x and y. So because we can't assign the independent variable x, we have to be extremely careful about making sure that we are taking all of these other variables z into account, so that we're not making wrong judgments and wrong conclusions about the relationship between x and y because of a spurious relationship driven by variables that we haven't accounted for. This is the main reason why we usually cannot do causal inference based on observational research. This doesn't mean that observational research is useless, though. In fact, this is probably the most common approach in political science, to test a causal theory using observational data, where we can find associations between variables that we're interested in and use those as evidence in favor of our causal theory, even though we can't definitively say that there is a causal relationship between x and y in the direction that we theorize. So there are two primary types of observational studies. They are cross-sectional and time series observational studies. And these types of studies differ in the sort of variation that they are interested in explaining. So cross-sectional studies are primarily interested in explaining variation across units. So variation across people, or variation across districts, or variation across countries, whatever your unit of analysis is, comparing different ones of those units to one another and explaining that variation. Whereas time series studies are primarily interested in explaining variation over time. So let's talk about each of those approaches in a little bit more detail and take a look at examples of data of each type. So in a cross-sectional study, we want to understand variation in the dependent variable, the outcome y, across these individual units that we're studying. So what makes citizens different from one another in terms of the dependent variable that we're studying? Or what makes states different from one another in terms of the dependent variable? Or what makes countries different from one another in terms of the dependent variable? So an example of this would be if we wanted to know what the connection was between voter preferences in a particular district and the behavior of the representative of that district in terms of voting. So the outcome is the representative's voting behavior, and our independent variable is voter preferences. So our unit of analysis is each of these individual representatives from different districts, and we're trying to explain variation in the dependent variable, voting behavior, across these representatives. And so we're going to study an aggregated measure of voter preferences from those districts and then look at what the voting records of those representatives are and try to understand what causes the variation in that voting behavior. Another example would be if we wanted to study the relationship between government debt and the unemployment rate in a whole bunch of different countries. So on this slide, we see an example of cross-sectional data dealing with this particular research question. So for each country, we've collected data on government debt as a percentage of gross national product, as well as the unemployment rate in that country. So this is a cross-section because we're comparing across these units that we're studying, in this case, countries, and we're collecting data on each of those countries at a particular moment in time. So in Finland, government debt is 6.6% of GNP and the unemployment rate is 2.6%. So this is what cross-sectional data looks like. We have all of our units and then we have data on our variables for each of those units. In time series observational data, we're measuring variation within one particular unit over time. So, for example, how does the behavior of one representative change over time? Or how do variables in one particular country change over time? So an example of this would be if we're interested in how the media covers the economy and whether that affects public concern about the economy. So if the media talks a lot about a problem of inflation, does the public become more concerned about inflation? And when the media doesn't talk about inflation as much, does public concern about inflation go down? So what we're interested in is a whole bunch of measures over time about how the media is talking about economic problems and what public attitudes about those economic problems are. So we're taking a whole bunch of measures of the same variables in the same context, so the same country, over time. And the primary thing that we're interested in is that temporal variation. In this type of study, as in any type of study, we need to focus on the possibility that there could be other variables influencing the relationship between x and y that we observe. So are there other variables z that might be influencing both x and y? So in this particular example, a really important thing to pay attention to is how the state of the economy actually is changing over time. Because it could be that economic conditions affect both how people feel about the economy and how the media talks about the economy. So in time series research, as in all research, we need to consider the possibility of other variables that are affecting the relationships that we observe. So an example of time series data is here. In this case, we're looking at the relationship between the inflation rate and presidential approval over a whole series of months. So in this case, all of the months in 2002. So for every month from January to December, we take a measure of presidential approval and the inflation rate in order to try to see if this relationship holds up over time. So if as the inflation rate goes up, presidential approval declines. So that is just what time series data looks like. It is data collected at a whole bunch of different time points about the variables that we are interested in. You might be curious about whether we can explore variation over time and across units at the same time in the same research study, and the answer is that we can. That kind of research is cross-sectional time series research. For example, we might want to know about something like the relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate in a whole bunch of different countries over time. So we would collect data at like yearly intervals in each of the countries that we're interested in, and then we would do our study based on that data. So the methods that we need to analyze that kind of data are a bit beyond the scope of this class, but it is certainly possible to explore both of those sources of variation in the same study. So we've talked a lot in the past couple of lectures about the importance of controlling for possible confounding variables. But how many variables should we try to control for? The answer is just that we should control for all of the possibly relevant ones. And this is, of course, something that can be difficult to do. It can be hard to understand, get your head around, or think of all of the different variables that could impact the independent variable and the dependent variable that you are interested in. But the answer is that if you want to make sure that you have valid inference from your observational study, it is important to control for all of these factors. So the process of controlling for these variables is a statistical one. We use statistical controls, and we're going to be talking a bit about how we actually do that in practice later in this course. So don't worry, you're going to figure out how exactly we take these variables into account. But for right now, just need to understand conceptually why that is important. Our final note on this subject is going back to the questions of external and internal validity and how those types of validity are related to the types of research design that we have. So recall that experimental studies are considered very internally valid because the experimental random assignment process allows us to eliminate our worry about confounding variables influencing the relationship that we observe between x and y. We can be very confident in the causal relationship that we find between x and y in an experimental study. In an observational study, internal validity is more of a problem. There is more of a potential for reverse causality to be driving a relationship that we see between our variables, and for omitted variables, for other factors, z, to be influencing the relationship between x and y that we observe if we don't properly take that into account in our research design. So we can't be as sure in an observational study about x really causing y as we can in an experiment. However, because observational studies are fundamentally about just observing what is going on in the real world, we can have a higher degree of confidence about the external validity of our findings. So, in an observational study, particularly if we follow good random sampling procedures that allow us to generalize from our study to a whole population, we're observing things that are happening in the real world, and so we can be confident that what we observe is representative of actual processes that happen in the real world. In experimental settings, those are more artificial, and so external validity can be more of a problem. So, in an observational study, the results that we find are more likely to generalize to populations and to phenomena outside of the scope of our study than the results from experiments are. So, experimental studies and observational studies each have strengths and weaknesses. And as you decide which of these approaches to follow as you try to answer your particular research question, really depends on the details of your particular project. So, in some cases, an experimental approach is just not possible, in which case you're going to have to go with an observational approach. In some cases, you're going to have a choice between experimental and observational research designs, and in that case, you have to make a judgment call about your priorities about internal and external validity, the resources that you have to bring to bear on this particular research project, and just what your personal preferences are. That brings us to the end of our lecture on observational research. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you next time.